Hi everyone! Welcome to Tangerine Planet, a place for kind thoughts, smart ideas, and a little sunshine for the world. Let's make a difference, one step at a time, together.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, all the articles, the research, the notes you send us, and really dig into them, trying to pull out the key insights and basically giving you a shortcut to getting up to speed. Today, we're diving into something that, well, it sets a pretty intense scene. Think back to the mid-20th century, the Cold War at its peak, that feeling of global precariousness, the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation. It was a massive existential threat. Now jump forward to today. We're facing another huge global danger, maybe quieter, but definitely accelerating. Climate change. It feels like a similar kind of urgency, a universal challenge, right? Mirroring the gravity of that nuclear age. And it makes you wonder, it poses this really intriguing question. What if the way we managed or tried to manage the spread of atomic weapons, what if that could actually give us a blueprint for curbing fossil fuels? The main thing driving our climate crisis now. So that's our mission today. We've gone through your sources, articles, research papers, expert notes, and we're going to deep dive into this idea that seems to be gaining a lot of ground. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
It's a really powerful parallel to draw, and maybe a necessary one. The mid-20th century, humanity was genuinely teetering on the brink. The world was staring down the barrel of nuclear proliferation. It was a threat so huge, so all-encompassing, it absolutely demanded some kind of unified global legal response. And those high stakes, they did eventually lead to some groundbreaking international agreements. They forged a path, maybe not a perfect path, but a path away from what looked like catastrophe. And the parallels with our climate reality now are, well, they're striking and, honestly, quite worrying. Both are clearly existential threats. Both need unprecedented global cooperation, something that goes way beyond just individual national interests. It really calls for a collective reckoning with these huge global consequences. It's about looking back, isn't it? Learning from what worked, what didn't, even when the challenges seemed impossible.
Exactly. So we'll start by really digging into that historical precedent, the nuclear non-proliferation story, not just the what, but the how, the mechanisms they put in place. Then I'll pivot to now. Why are current climate efforts, after nearly, 3 decades of talk, seemingly falling short? After that, we'll get into the specifics of this new proposal, this Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. What exactly is it aiming for? How does it link back to that nuclear model? And finally, we'll unpack the road ahead. It's ambitious, so what's the support like, and what are the big obstacles it's facing? Okay, let's get into it.
Right, let's rewind back to the 1950s, a really pivotal moment. The Cold War is absolutely raging. You can almost feel the tension, that constant fear of a nuclear war ending everything. There was this widespread, very real fear that if too many countries got their hands on nuclear weapons, just one mistake, one accident, could trigger a global disaster. And against that backdrop, in 1958, Ireland's Minister for External Affairs, Frank Aiken, stood up at the UN General Assembly. And he asked this incredibly stark, insightful question that just captured the whole mood.
How can the course of history be turned away from death and towards life? It wasn't just rhetoric, was it? It was a desperate call for action. Aiken really believed that these modern weapons, especially nuclear ones, were just too destructive. They demanded a legal solution, something globally binding. He wasn't just talking about talks. He wanted universal negotiations, a proper international framework to stop the spread and control their use. He saw really clearly that the stakes were just too high for anything less. It needed a unified legal response to change how nations dealt with this tech.
And that urgency, it just ramped up dramatically a few years later. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, the world came terrifyingly close to full-blown nuclear war. For 13 days, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were, eyeball to eyeball over Soviet missiles in Cuba. This wasn't some abstract threat anymore. It was real, tangible. Humanity was right on the edge. That crisis, it was the crucible, really. It created that critical urgency, the push needed for nations to finally act decisively. The intense diplomacy that followed, led by people like Aiken and others who saw the writing on the wall, it paid off. By 1961, even before the crisis, the UN had already unanimously agreed that nuclear proliferation was an urgent problem needing a legal framework. The Cuban Missile Crisis just cemented that resolve. It shifted the whole conversation from talk to immediate, concrete action. It laid the groundwork for, one of the most important treaties ever.
And the result of all that pressure was the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. A landmark deal, a kind of grand bargain in international relations. It came into force in 1970. And what's really amazing, showing how seriously everyone took the threat, is how many countries joined. 191 states. That's huge. One of the most widely ratified arms control treaties ever. And crucially, it included the 5 biggest nuclear powers at the time: the US, the USSR, the UK, France, and China. Their commitment was key. These 5 nuclear weapon states, as the treaty calls them, promised not to give nukes to anyone else and not to help any non-nuclear state get them. It was about stopping horizontal proliferation, stopping the weapons spreading to new countries. Although it's interesting, isn't it? The US, UK, USSR were in early, but France and China, they didn't actually join until the 1990s, decades later. It shows that even with these existential threats, getting everyone, especially all the major players, on board from day one, well, it can take a really long time. But the treaty still became a global norm.
Absolutely. And like any big international agreement, the NPT had its strengths, but also some significant weaknesses. On the plus side, it definitely established a strong international norm against proliferation. It clearly stopped some countries from developing nuclear weapons who might have otherwise, and it legally obliged states to negotiate disarmament. That was crucial, even if progress turned out to be painfully slow. It also set up a framework for sharing peaceful nuclear technology, trying to balance non-proliferation with access for civilian energy, that sort of thing. But its effectiveness in actually driving disarmament, that really started to falter, maybe around 2010. It wasn't just a lack of political will, though that was part of it. Geopolitics shifted, new security threats popped up, and existing nuclear powers started emphasizing deterrence again. So instead of getting rid of their arsenals, despite public promises, many were doing the opposite, modernizing warheads, developing new delivery systems, relying more on nuclear deterrence. So yeah, it largely stopped the horizontal spread to new countries, but its record on vertical disarmament among those who already had bombs was much, much weaker, and that created ongoing frustration for non-nuclear states.
That's a really important distinction, and it highlights the limits, even of a treaty like the NPT. Because that progress on disarmament stalled, a successor agreement came along, one with a much more direct approach. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, this one goes much further. Its whole point is to completely prohibit nuclear weapons among its members, outlawing use, development, possession, even threatening to use them. It's a big shift from just non-proliferation to outright prohibition. It only entered into force recently, 2021, but remarkably, it already has half the UN on board. Over 90 states have signed or ratified. That really signals a renewed global desire for a more decisive, maybe more morally driven action on disarmament, especially from countries without nuclear weapons and those most vulnerable.
Right. And Susie Snyder from ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, she makes a fascinating point. She thinks a fossil fuel treaty could shift the landscape on climate change, much like the TPNW is doing for nukes. And here's the key part. She argues it should be modeled less on the NPT, with its 2 tiers installed disarmament, and more on the TPNW. Why? Because the TPNW is more proactive, more direct. It focuses on the basic immorality, the unacceptability of the weapons themselves. For example, the TPNW gave governments a real, legal tool to respond to nuclear threats, like the ones that started flying around after Russia invaded Ukraine. In 2022, the treaty parties issued this powerful statement condemning all those threats as violating international law. That's concrete action. Plus, the TPNW has helped build trust through clear rules for inspections and transparency, verifying that nuclear tech is only used peacefully. It shows prohibition can actually work in practice. And importantly, it's put real pressure on investors to ditch companies involved in making nuclear weapons. It's starting to shift capital away from the industry. So that kind of financial pressure, combined with a clear moral and legal ban, makes the TPNW a much more powerful model for a fossil fuel treaty than the NPT, which got bogged down in slow disarmament promises. It proves, doesn't it, that even without the big players signing on immediately, a treaty can still set a powerful global norm and start changing behavior through other means.
So looking back at that whole nuclear story, what's the big takeaway for our climate challenge today? What we see is this really powerful historical precedent, right? Global legal frameworks born out of huge crises were designed and put in place to curb an existential threat. Maybe not perfectly, but they did it. And they did it against these incredibly complex backdrops, Cold War tensions, powerful states maybe not wanting it initially. It shows we can act collectively when things get really dire. And it shows international law isn't fixed. It can evolve, pushed by civil society and the will of nations to meet new threats. And maybe the crucial lesson from the TPNW for this fossil fuel idea is its power to shift norms and apply that indirect pressure, even without everyone signing on right away. That combination of a moral ban, financial pressure, civil society action, it can change the conversation globally and make something that was acceptable, like fossil fuels, much riskier politically and economically, even for countries that haven't joined. So the big question is, can we do it again? Can we take these lessons from the nuclear age and apply them to climate change? The blueprint's there, but the context, it is different. And that difference brings us right up to today. Humanity is yet again at another really precarious point. We are dangerously close to hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. That's the threshold scientists keep warning us about, risking massive, irreversible changes to health, lives, everything. We're talking more extreme heat waves, devastating droughts, food shortages, people having to move en masse, huge shifts threatening society itself. Back in 2023, another Irish leader, former President Mary Robinson, warned starkly about an existential threat from climate change. And tragically, her warning was underlined by the fact that 2023 was the hottest year on record, and 2024 looks set to follow that trend. The urgency feels incredibly real, just like it did in the nuclear age.
But despite that clear urgency, when you look at the diplomatic efforts, it's honestly quite frustrating. Nearly 30 years of negotiations under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. They just haven't managed to stop greenhouse gas emissions from rising. The whole UNFCCC process with the yearly COPs has really struggled to get beyond small steps. And what's really striking, maybe even alarming, is that fossil fuels themselves, the absolute key driver of climate change, causing like 80% of human emissions recently. They're still just a tiny part of the official discussions at the big climate conferences. Think about COP29 in Baku. The core problem, the actual source of the emissions, it just seemed to constantly get sidelined in the official agreements. It's like the elephant in the room that everyone knows is there, but no one wants to directly confront with binding rules about supply.
That's a massive disconnect, isn't it? A huge gap right at the heart of climate strategy. And here's a fact that really hammers it home. The Paris Agreement from 2015, hailed as this huge breakthrough, right? Well, he has absolutely no explicit mention of fossil fuels anywhere in the main text. Zero. Just think about that. The primary cause of the problem is completely absent from the main global agreement designed to fix it. It took years, literally years, of pressure from activists and vulnerable countries to even slightly change that. It wasn't until COP28 in Dubai, just last year, that nations finally agreed to explicitly transition away from coal, oil, and gas. But even that phrase, transition away, it sounds good, but it fell way short of the full phase-out that so many countries and scientists were calling for, the phase-out the science says we need. And even worse, some governments and industry players quickly started downplaying even that weaker pledge, calling it sort of optional guidance. It just undermines the whole thing. It feels like too little, too late, and way too watered down.
Yeah, and Fergus Green, a political scientist at UCL, he suggests this isn't accidental. He argues it's been a deliberate strategy, mainly from the big fossil fuel-producing countries and companies. Their tactic, he says, is to keep the focus on emissions, the demand side, and on technologies like carbon capture, rather than directly tackling the supply, the source of the emissions. And that strategy has let them avoid any direct mandate to stop producing their main product. We've heard accusations for years about the fossil fuel industry's influence, haven't we? Heavy lobbying, funding climate denial, deliberately confusing the issue for decades to delay real action. And it's still happening. There was that secret recording apparently from COP29 showing a senior official discussing possible fossil fuel deals during the climate summit. It just shows how that influence is still there, often behind the scenes working against the stated climate goals.
So when you put all that together, what really jumps out at you about this huge gap between what governments say they'll do and what they're actually doing? It's just so obvious when you look at who's hosting these climate talks. Recent hosts like Azerbaijan, the UAE, and an upcoming one, Brazil. They are all planning major expansions in fossil fuels, according to Oil Change International's research. These are the countries leading the global talks to cut emissions. It's like, I don't know, asking someone who owns a cigarette factory to lead a stop smoking campaign. It just doesn't add up. Even though the International Energy Agency says the shift to renewables is unstoppable, they're also crystal clear. The global phase-down of fossil fuels is just not happening fast enough, not nearly fast enough for 1.5C. It's not just a small contradiction, it's this fundamental paradox, isn't it? Right at the heart of climate strategy. It risks locking in emissions for decades and undermining everything else. Promises without action on the source, they're just not cutting it. Time is running out. Okay, so given those failings, that big disconnect, this bold new idea has emerged. Something aiming to hit the problem at its source in a way current deals haven't. This is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, the FFNPT, and it's being pushed by this really diverse, growing group governments, top academics, international lawyers, activists on the ground. They're all united by this urgent feeling that we need a new global treaty specifically to tackle the supply of fossil fuels head-on, like we did with nuclear weapons. A proactive approach, not just reactive.
Yeah, and the roots of this idea actually go back to the places feeling the impacts most sharply. The Pacific Islands Development Forum, this was back in 2016. Leaders from these low-lying islands, facing existential threats from rising seas, they started demanding something more radical. They called for a new global dialogue about maybe a moratorium on fossil fuels. They realized existing approaches just weren't working for them. They talked about needing a new treaty that could create a new source of international law. Then the idea really got fleshed out and gained academic weight in 2019, thanks to a key journal article by Peter Newell and Andrew Sims at the University of Sussex. They formally proposed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, explicitly using that nuclear analogy, giving the whole movement a solid academic and legal footing.
And its scope is really ambitious, directly mirroring that nuclear blueprint we talked about. The FFNPT basically has three main pillars, sometimes summed up as stop, shift, and support, but covering several key goals. First, stop all new exploration and production of coal, oil, and gas, period. This isn't just slowing down, it's a hard stop on expanding the fossil fuel frontier. No new coal mines, oil wells, gas fields, anywhere. Prevent those carbon bombs. Second, phase out existing stockpiles and production. A managed fair decline, not just a sudden cliff edge. So carefully decommissioning infrastructure, managing supply to avoid chaos, ensuring a smooth transition off these fuels. Third, and this is vital for fairness, speed up the transfer of clean energy tech to poorer nations, along with the money and technical help they need.
Right, that recognizes that wealthier nations cause most of the problem historically, so they have responsibility to help developing countries leapfrog to clean energy, rather than forcing them to choose between development and climate action.
Exactly. And fourth, maybe the most complex part, enable a just transition for workers and communities who currently depend on fossil fuels. This means more than just retraining. It's about restructuring whole economies, supporting millions of people, making sure the green transition creates good, fair jobs for everyone, especially in those vulnerable regions. It needs huge investment, social safety nets, real local understanding.
And fifth, linked to that, helping countries still dependent on fossil fuels to diversify their economies. It's a really comprehensive vision trying to tackle the environmental crisis and the huge social and economic challenges of this shift.
Now, how does this fit with things like the Paris Agreement? Is it meant to replace it?
No, not at all. Amir Samas from the FFNPT initiative has been really clear on this. She said, when we first launched, there was an impression that we don't believe in the Paris Agreement, we don't believe in the UNFCCC, but that's not true. Her point is more pragmatic. It's based on the slow pace and, well, the limitations of what's happened so far. It took 28 years just to get fossil fuels mentioned in the COP texts, and even then it was weak. She argues pretty compellingly that we have such a limited carbon budget left, very little time to hit 1.5C, and despite progress elsewhere, certain goals are being missed. So the FFNPT isn't about ditching Paris. It's seen as a vital addition, a complementary tool. It's meant to fill that big gap by focusing directly on supply, which Paris largely ignores. It's about accelerating the transition with a more direct legal instrument, getting ahead of the problem, not just cleaning up after it.
And those missed goals you mentioned, they're not just abstract, are they? The reality is the national pledges countries have made under Paris, their NDCs, even if they meet them all, they still add up to way too much warming, like 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius, way beyond the 1.5C target scientists say is relatively safe. Plus, a lot of these pledges rely heavily on technologies like large-scale carbon capture or direct air capture that, frankly, don't exist at the scale needed yet or are unproven. That creates this really dangerous gap between what's promised and what's actually possible right now. It lets countries make net zero promises based on future tech fixes instead of making the immediate deep cuts to fossil fuel production and use that are needed now. It's like promising to build a bridge over a flooding river but having no concrete, no plans, just hoping someone invents a magic levitation device later. Meanwhile, the water's rising.
Exactly. And layering onto that problem, making everything harder, is the whole issue of climate finance. It's a huge sticking point. You hear deep frustration from poorer countries about that promised $100 billion a year in climate finance from richer nations. Help for adapting, help for transitioning. Now, the OECD says that target was finally met in 2022, but when you dig into it, a lot of it is loans, not grants. And a lot seems to be existing development aid just being relabeled as climate finance, not actually new money.
So it adds to their debt burden, potentially.
Precisely. And it massively erodes trust. Poorer nations, many already drowning in debt, are being asked to borrow more to fix a problem, largely caused by the historic emissions of wealthy countries. They see it as an accounting trick, not genuine new support. It makes them deeply skeptical about any new grand plans or treaties, especially ones asking them to limit their own fossil fuel development that could, short-term, boost their economies. This lack of fair and sufficient finance isn't just about money, it's a fundamental breakdown of trust. It's maybe the single biggest barrier to getting global cooperation on climate, making it incredibly hard to convince developing nations to sign up for ambitious new things without robust, just financial backing. It feels like asking them to pay, with borrowed money, for a mess they didn't make.
Okay, so despite those big challenges, the skepticism, the trust issues, this fossil fuel treaty idea has actually picked up a lot of endorsements, hasn't it? From a really wide range of places. We're talking hundreds of endorsements. Cities like Vancouver, subnational governments, indigenous groups like the Alwajan people in Peru groups right on the front lines, and big global bodies too, the World Health Organization, seeing the health impacts, the European Parliament, even the Vatican, adding that moral weight, plus thousands of scientists and academics have signed on, giving it that intellectual backing. It really shows a growing consensus outside of national governments, doesn't it? A feeling from civil society, scientists, vulnerable groups, that this direct approach is needed.
It absolutely does. But the core challenge remains getting states, actual national governments, to formally buy in and commit to joining. So far, despite all that other support, only a handful of states have explicitly said they'll back it, mostly small, vulnerable island nations. Now, their voice is incredibly important given what they face, but they're small emitters, their global impact is limited, and their economic clout isn't huge. The big exception, the potential game changer, is Colombia. In December 2023, they became the first major fossil fuel producer to endorse the treaty idea.
That is significant.
It's hugely significant. It shows endorsement isn't just coming from non-producers. Colombia's decision, driven by climate worries but also wanting a new economic path, really opens the door. It shows other producers could consider it, even though, as we'll see, it comes with real risks for those who stick their neck out first.
Right. And what about critical mass? How many countries need to join for this treaty to really have teeth, to make a difference globally?
Well, Johan von Bernstorff, who's a professor of international law, he suggests that hitting around 50 states would be the point where it gets taken seriously on the world stage. He says, if you have more than 50, other states take it seriously, other institutions take it seriously, especially if it keeps on growing. It's about building that diplomatic momentum, making it feel inevitable. And we can look back at the NPT history again. Remember France and China, both nuclear powers, but they didn't join until the 1990s, decades after it started.
Yeah, good point.
It shows that major powers can eventually come around, especially as a treaty gains influence and legitimacy, and as the world changes around them. So a fossil fuel treaty might not need every big producer from day one. A strong core group could start shifting the norms and pull others in later.
And von Bernstorff also mentioned the importance of support from Western public authorities, right? Putting pressure on others.
Yes, he argues their support is crucial because it adds extra diplomatic and economic weight, pressuring others to react. We saw that dynamic with the TPNW, the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Norway initially supported it, which was a positive signal, but then they pulled back because of intense pressure from NATO allies, particularly the US, who see nukes as key to security.
So alliances can complicate things.
Hugely. But the good news for the TPNW was that by then, it already had enough support, that critical mass, so Norway leaving didn't kill it. It shows the tough balancing act states face. And it underlines the very real risks for countries that do lead. Look at Colombia again. Their environment minister, Susana Mohammed, said their credit rating was downgraded by agencies right after they announced they were stopping new fossil fuel exploration, even before they formally endorsed the treaty.
Wow, really? Direct economic pressure.
It seems like it. It's a stark warning about the potential consequences for countries daring to move first, maybe facing higher borrowing costs or less investment.
So given those risks, those uncomfortable trade-offs, as Fergus Green called them, it's understandable why some are skeptical, especially about big producers signing up. And you add that deep trust deficit that Harjit Singh from the Treaty Initiative mentioned, developing nations feeling let down by past UN talks.
Exactly. Singh acknowledges that loss of trust makes it very challenging to convince these countries that we need to have another multilateral process to achieve justice. After decades of broken promises, especially on finance, and facing the worst impacts of a crisis they didn't cause, why should they trust a new process led by the same global system?
It's a huge hurdle. So how are the treaty proponents planning to tackle that? How do they rebuild that trust and build the movement?
Singh talks about a strategy focused squarely on rebuilding trust through really broad, inclusive engagement with civil society. The initiative has held extensive consultations on health, faith, gender, human rights, bringing in voices often left out of traditional diplomacy. The goal is to ensure the treaty's principles are shaped from the ground up, reflecting diverse perspectives, especially from the global south and frontline communities, not just dictated by powerful states. He explicitly draws parallels to the successful grassroots campaigns behind other major treaties, like those banning landmines, chemical weapons, or protecting the ozone layer. He says, like them, we need to build a movement, and that movement building then helps us secure political buy-in. It has to come from the bottom up. And you see that in people like Omar El-Mawi in Kenya. He co-founded the Decolonize campaign and is now pushing for the treaty across Africa. He recognized early on that world leaders wouldn't just do this on their own. He said it was up to us to push them to see that this was inevitable. That's the kind of grassroots energy they're trying to harness.
And through those consultations, what's emerged as the absolute biggest sticking point, the number one thing needed to get countries on board?
Finance. Specifically, financing a just transition comes up again and again.
Not just any transition, but a fair one.
Exactly. It's not just about switching energy sources. It's about how you do it. Creating good green jobs, supporting communities that lose fossil fuel jobs, making sure the green transition itself doesn't cause new problems like resource exploitation or human rights abuses. Amir Sawas mentioned they're actively working on proposals and mechanisms that could be negotiated within a treaty initiative that would facilitate international cooperation for financing. Unquote. This could mean tackling really tough issues, like finding ways to reduce the massive debt burden many developing countries face, maybe debt for climate swaps, or even cancellation. It also means confronting those demands for compensation for climate loss and damage, and even addressing the legacy of colonialism, how historical injustices have created economic gaps and dependencies on extraction. Singh confirmed these issues. Compensation, colonialism, historical responsibility come up constantly in their consultations. It shows this treaty isn't just about CO2. It's deeply linked to global economic justice, trying to fix past wrongs and build a fairer future.
And what about the impact if, say, the really big producers don't sign on initially? Does it still achieve anything?
Von Bernstorff argues, yes, it could still have huge symbolic value and practical impact too, even without universal buy-in from the start. He says it would send a powerful signal to the international community and also to financial actors. Think banks, the World Bank, the IMF, regional development banks. That signal is new fossil fuel exploration is becoming unacceptable. It's a problem.
So it influences the money.
Precisely. That kind of global signal affects investment decisions. Banks and big financial institutions are already under pressure to consider ESG factors, environmental, social governance. They face reputational risks. A treaty like this makes financing new fossil fuel projects look much riskier. Insurers might hike premiums or refuse cover altogether. It raises the cost of capital for these projects, making them less attractive, less viable, even in countries that haven't signed the treaty. It's a way of squeezing supply through market forces and shifting global norms.
And it feels like that momentum is building, doesn't it?
It does seem to be. You have figures like former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon publicly calling for governments to negotiate the treaty. He said, momentum made past treaties a reality and we need it again. And Harjit Singh confirms that momentum is building. Okay, only 14 countries are publicly backing it right now, but the initiative is moving forward. They're working on a detailed legal roadmap and planning for the start of actual multilateral talks. It's moving beyond just being an idea in papers and activist meetings into something with a strategic plan, gaining political traction.
And they've already achieved some concrete things along the way, haven't they? Even before a treaty exists.
Yes, definitely. The Fossil Fuel Initiative has helped create the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels. That's a vital public database showing exactly what reserves, production, and emissions exist globally. Transparency is key. They've also worked on a toolkit offering practical advice on how countries can phase out fossil fuels equitably, sharing best practices. And maybe most significantly, they managed to get the core idea, the need for a fossil fuel phase-out, explicitly mentioned and endorsed in the UN's recent Pact for the Future document. That's a big step in mainstreaming the concept at the highest levels.
So the journey itself is making waves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As Singh put it, the world is much clearer now than ever about the cause of the climate crisis and the consequences and who should pay and what changes we need. He feels they've played a role with allies in bringing those demands together. He finished by saying, yes, we have our eyes set on a treaty, but the journey is equally important. It highlights that the whole process, building the movement, changing the conversation, shifting norms, that's hugely powerful in itself. It makes the end goal feel not just necessary, but maybe achievable. Hashtag tag outro.
So wrapping this up, we've seen how that terrifying fear of nuclear war pushed the world towards an unprecedented legal framework, a kind of blueprint for global action against an existential threat. And now, facing this equally immense climate threat, a similar, really bold proposal is taking shape, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. It feels like a testament maybe to human ingenuity, but also to our capacity for collective action when we're really pushed, when we face a common, overwhelming danger.
It really does. And it leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? In today's world, with all the information overloads, these incredibly complex global problems, the fragmented politics, what role do these kinds of rebellious treaties actually play? Treaties born from grassroots movements, from civil society, from the voices of the most vulnerable. How much can they really push powerful states and shape our future? Maybe history gives us a clue. It often shows that huge systemic change doesn't always start top-down with governments leading the way. Often it bubbles up from below, from that persistent collective demand from citizens, scientists, frontline communities, building momentum until it just can't be ignored anymore.
We really hope this deep dive has given you that shortcut to getting informed on what is a critical and still unfolding story. Keep digging, keep asking those questions, and as always, keep being curious.
Thanks for being with us today. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and tap the bell to keep the good vibes going. Let's join into healing our little world one step at a time, together. And all this is Tangerine Planet. Until next time.